A major development to tell you about this morning concerning the controversial Trans Mountain pipeline. The federal government has agreed to buy it from Kinder Morgan.
CTV's Ben Milger has been following this breaking news for us. Ben, how much is this going to cost?
Carrie, Canadian taxpayers now own this project at a cost of $4.5 billion for the existing pipeline and the controversial expansion. Ottawa will go ahead with construction, which it says it wants to wrap up this week to get in front of the summer building season. The feds are also still seeking other investors, but say until this point, the focus was on getting this deal done, and they have not had serious discussions with buyers. Of course, for anyone who does buy the project, it also comes with protesters who have promised to block construction.
We will recognize that Canadians have a right to express their point of view in a legal fashion, and that will continue to be an important part of our democracy.
So, Ben, the feds are in for $4.5 billion already. What about construction costs?
That's another multi-billion-dollar question, and one the finance minister refused to give straight answers to at this morning's press conference. As a starting point, though, Kinder Morgan pegged construction costs at between $200 and $300 million per month.
Our government's position is clear. It must be built, and it will be built.
A bombshell announcement, the federal government saying it will buy the Trans Mountain pipeline. Of course, this is making news from coast to coast, and the price tag is pretty hefty as well, Paul.
Oh, it's a big one. Thanks so much, Sonia. $4.5 billion big. That's how much the feds will pay for the Trans Mountain pipeline, saying this project must get done. Jordan Armstrong is tracking this story this morning. Jordan, reaction continues to roll in.
Oh yeah, lots of reaction, Paul. The finance minister says that $4.5 billion is a fair price for Canadians and for shareholders of the company, but it's important to point out that price tag does not include construction costs, which we're hearing could be upwards of $7 billion, so they haven't put that on the books just yet. Bill Morneau says Kinder Morgan will go ahead with its original plan to twin the pipeline this summer while the sale is finalized, which likely won't happen until August. Morneau says once the sale is complete, Canada will continue the construction on its own, with a view to eventually selling the whole thing down the road once market conditions would allow it to get the best price. As well, there are still a number of court challenges, the big one in the federal Court of Appeal by a number of First Nations arguing they were not adequately consulted by the National Energy Board. And until that is settled, there remains some degree of uncertainty here. And the protests, of course, those aren't going away anytime soon. The finance minister was asked about that today, and he really didn't provide any answers on how Ottawa plans to deal with those protests. Paul?
And they will be there. Thanks, Jordan. Now, local politicians are weighing in as well, including Burnaby South MP and Vancouver mayoral candidate Kennedy Stewart, who joins us from Vancouver. Kennedy, thank you very much for coming on the show. You were arrested for protesting pipelines, so I have an idea of where you stand. Your thoughts on today's announcement?
Well, I think Canadians really have to know what they bought into here. The original pipeline was built in 1953, and it leaks like a sieve. It's leaked 40,000 barrels since it was built, including major spills in Burnaby and along the rest of the route. It is in very bad repair, and in fact is in illegal areas in a lot of cases, running smack through the middle of First Nations reserves and through highly populated residential communities. They're going to have to sink hundreds of millions of dollars into the old pipeline in order to get it up to snuff, let alone the new pipeline. So this project could be $15–20 billion of taxpayers' money. It is a bad idea.
Bad idea. Okay, so 40,000 barrels, that's over a 60-year time period. Now, a lot of people will say that oil sort of stirs the drink of the Canadian economy. Ottawa, Alberta, they're both saying that we're losing millions by the day by not building this pipeline, billions if it doesn't get built at all. What do you say to that?
Well, I think that, they have their kind of future projections, but I'm talking about the reality right now. I've walked this pipeline route, I've gone on the reserves, I've gone in the communities in Burnaby and across the Lower Mainland. The original route, the original pipeline is literally a few meters away from people's homes, which is not legal. So I think the company is, the government has really pulled a, they've got a huge white elephant here, and the Kinder Morgan, like usual, is making off like bandits, laughing all the way back to Texas.
Interesting. I mean, your premier, our Premier Horgan, there's some are saying that this is giving him an out. This situation now gives him an out on this whole decision, this whole moving forward. Yeah, I know there's court decisions that still hang in the balance, but some are saying it does give him an out. What do you want the premier to do right now?
I think the Premier's been doing the thing he should be doing, is protecting British Columbians. Look, this thing, so we have some kind of loose agreements with First Nations. There's dozens of them across the pipeline route. I think if I was them, I'd be renegotiating these agreements, because it not only affects the new pipeline, it's the old pipeline too, which again, I believe goes through 15 reserves and at least 80 First Nations territories. So I think that the government has really stepped in it today. I mean, if the biggest pipeline company in the world can't make this work, why would the government make it work? And they're risking billions, I would say 15 to 20 billion when this price is over. Who's going to buy that from them? This is a desperate move, and really, I'm still going to do everything I can to stop it.
Yeah, and I think that that's something that a lot of people will continue to protest and try and stop it. As far as British Columbia is concerned, I mean, there's a lot of people who were pro-pipeline, a lot of people that are anti-pipeline, but people who are kind of 50-50 on the issue. What do you think they are feeling about this announcement, and where do they stand after this?
Well, I think, sure, maybe the province is split half and half on the new pipeline, but ask them how they feel about spending $15 to $20 billion in taxpayers' money to buy this infrastructure when they could be putting it into housing or healthcare. I mean, we haven't had any housing units built here in the city of Vancouver by the federal government, but yet they can give a pipeline company $4.5 billion for a rickety old thing built in the 1950s. Like, this is very poor judgment, and it shows what their priorities are. Their priorities are a Texas oil giant versus their own people, and I think it's a shame, and Trudeau really has stepped in it here.
Interesting to get your take on it. Thank you very much. Burnaby South MP, Vancouver mayoral candidate Kennedy Stewart, thank you for your time, sir. Crews at a Kinder Morgan facility near Kamloops are cleaning up from a minor oil spill. About 100 liters of crude leaked into the ground at the Darfield pump station early Sunday morning. Officials say no oil got into any waterways. Protesters say it's a perfect example of just how unsafe it would be for the environment.
Yeah, these are our headwaters. The salmon, they come up the Fraser River and into the Thompson. Our headwaters are in the Adams River as well. And if the salmon species dies, 137 species die with them. Who knows how much oil is spilt there? And look at where the river is. It's right next to this.
Vancouver has launched a claim to recover costs from an oil spill that happened 3 years ago.
A system right now does not work. It does not actually go after the ship owners and get the full compensation for the costs.
The city taking the owners of the Marathassett to court over that 2015 spill that dumped 2,700 liters of bunker fuel into English Bay. It contaminated beaches and took more than 2 weeks to clean up. Mayor Gregor Robertson says the city hasn't seen a cent, adding it would be catastrophic if a tanker were to do the same thing.
The oil tankers carrying diluted bitumen is a huge risk, a huge threat, and the costs and impacts right now look virtually impossible to deal with for us. Based on what's happening today and 3 years of struggling to get a minor compensation package for the last small oil spill.
The announcement this morning by Finance Minister Bill Morneau and reaction to it.
The audacity of the member opposite to talk about not getting a pipeline to market, which is what he and his party were unable to do, when we have stepped forward and said that we are going to take the decision to put a project in the national interest forward so that we can create the economic advantage that we're seeking. The economic advantage for Canada with $15 billion of advantage to our economy, 15,000 jobs. We, Mr. Speaker, are moving forward in the national interest for Canadians.
The federal government has made a choice, a decision that was motivated by the decisions of a private company who gave a deadline not to me, not to the people of British Columbia, but to someone they characterized as stakeholders. The federal government has responded, and that's their business.
Do you believe that you've cost taxpayers $4.5 billion?
I made no such undertaking of tax dollars, quite the contrary. The accountability for those decisions should rest with the people who made them, and that's the federal government and, by inference, the government of Alberta.
Joining us live for some analysis are our Legislative Bureau Chief Keith Balder in Victoria and CKNW's Charles Adler in Vancouver. First of all, Keith, this morning's announcement came as a bit of a surprise to many. Other than a looming deadline, what's your take on why this move?
Well, I think it speaks a couple of things. First of all, I think it was becoming clear Kinder Morgan was just not interested in pursuing this project. The fact they set that deadline of May 31st was the first sign that they were prepared to walk away from this, because I think their excuse was that there was too much political delay. Well, there's no evidence there's any less politically driven delay, particularly from BC's perspective, since that deadline was imposed. So I think it was started to form the basis of an exit strategy for Kinder Morgan. But Justin Trudeau has gone all in on this pipeline. He has staked his entire political capital on this thing being built. If it's not built, he suffers enormously. So Kinder Morgan basically stared down Ottawa here. Ottawa had no choice, really, at the end of the day, to go all in on this with potentially tax dollars. So they're going to be exposing the taxpayers to at least $4.5 billion, but the cost will be significantly more than that, Colleen, because 4.5 gets you the existing pipeline, the terminal, and some of the infrastructure, but the expansion itself is another $7 billion or so, and there's some ongoing expenses attached with that as well. There's also the spill response strategy, $1.5 billion there. So the costs will mount here, but Trudeau government, I think, is in a desperate situation. They had to do what needed to be done to get this thing built, and that meant exposing the taxpayers to significant financial risk.
Charles, I'm sure you remember something called the Hibernia oil fields, a deal that was struck in 1993, which was very similar to what's going on now, where the federal government purchased it with the intent to sell. We still own it.
Of course we still own it. Look, I mean, just from and I don't want to make an apology for being part of the private sector, but I'm a private sector person, and this is how private sector people see something. Kinder Morgan saw a chump in Trudeau and Morneau, because Trudeau and Morneau were motivated buyers. They had basically telegraphed and gone beyond telegraphed that they were willing to buy this thing. So they buy a 65-year-old pipe, which is worth approximately $3.5 billion, and they pay another $1 billion, okay, because they're motivated buyers, and that hurts their position. So Kinder Morgan down in Texas loves that particular position. Now, the same bunch that is overpaying by $1 billion for old pipe is telling people, investors, anybody around the world, that they're willing to sell this as soon as possible. So the motivated buyer that's paying $1 billion penalty is now a motivated seller, which means they'll pay a penalty on the other side. They're going to buy high and possibly sell cheap. So from a private sector perspective, once again, this thing looks like a real loser.
This could be a very ugly summer going forward.
Oh, yes. I think if you're up on Burnaby Mountain, I would expect there's going to be, those protests are going to ramp up again. I'm not sure if it's going to happen immediately, but that August deadline to find a new purchaser means that construction likely will begin anew. You remember Kinder Morgan, when they announced that deadline, they were saying they were halting all but essential construction activities on the project, which means potentially you're going to see more activity on Burnaby Mountain, which means you're going to have a lot more protests there as well.
No kidding. BC Green Party leader Andrew Weaver had some harsh words for the Trudeau Liberals, calling this decision a betrayal. Our reporter Richard Zussman is at the legislature in Victoria with Andrew Weaver now. Richard.
Hi, Colleen. So I am here with Andrew Weaver, and we were just hearing one of the things you said today was calling this a betrayal. Explain to us why you believe the decision today by Ottawa was a betrayal.
Well, Trudeau got elected on a message of hope for young people. We had a surge in youth between the ages of 18 and 24 vote. A surge because they believed him in terms of him leading the charge on dealing with climate change, in terms of his promises on proportional representation. What we saw today was a colossal failure on two fronts. Number one, fiscally irresponsible, and number two, environmentally irresponsible. As if somehow this is good for anybody for him to bail out a company that was looking for an exit strategy. The people who are celebrating right now are Kinder Morgan shareholders in the U.S., not Kinder Morgan Canada shareholders. That stock tanked today, down another 50 cents, trading at $16.10, 90 cents below the initial public offering. What Trudeau has done is he essentially said, we're going to take over this pipeline, the existing pipeline, and frankly, I still to this day do not believe the eventual pipeline will be built.
So explain to me how you believe that. You have to concede at this point that it seems like it's going to be a likelihood that this is going to be built. The federal government is going to own it, and they're going to be able to use that power to get this thing built through British Columbia to the coast.
Well, the reality is we just have to say what's been done today. Today, federal government said they would buy the existing pipeline to the coast. And that will happen probably in July unless he can find another investor. Next step is he has to find $8 billion to build the pipeline, because all he's doing is buying the existing pipeline and any existing debt. He's not building a pipeline. Now the federal government's saying we're going to be on the hook for another $8 billion. And now they're hoping some kind of investor might step up and back him. Well, investors around the world are moving away from this air sector into other sectors. There's reasons why Statoil, Total, Shell, Chevron, and numerous companies have divested themselves from the Alberta oil sands, because it's some of the most expensive oil in the world to get out, and the world is transforming away from fossil fuel use. So what Mr. Trudeau has done is absolutely reckless, and I feel for the retail shareholders of Kinder Morgan Canada, who I think being thrown under the bus here. He may claim it's going to go forward, but right now we need another $8 billion. Right now all he's done is give British Columbia certainty, frankly, that oil will flow to our Burnaby refinery, because the federal government will now own this pipeline as opposed to Kinder Morgan.
Public opinion is clearly changing on this issue. It seems that more British Columbians are in favor of this than they have been in the past. There's also the issue of jobs. So how would you potentially replace the jobs lost by a pipeline like this? And do you feel like the climate is changing?
What jobs?
The jobs to build the pipeline.
Okay, the jobs to build the pipeline and the 50 jobs to run stuff afterwards. 50 jobs. We were doing our anniversary event here in Alacrity in Victoria. We've had announcements there with respect to $300 million of investment. Companies that have grown from nothing to 50 million in a matter of years in a diverse array across our province. It is a myth to think that somehow our economy is driven by the oil sector. It's 2.2% nationally of our economy. The up and coming sectors are taking over, and what Trudeau has done is he's sent a signal to the market that we want to stay in the past. We want to invest in the horse-drawn buggy instead of moving forward and investing in the electric vehicle. So British Columbians, again, when they actually, and I've spoken with many, what British Columbians believe is that they want to do what's right for Canada. It is not right for Canada to transfer a substance that we cannot clean up, that is diluted bitumen, to a market that doesn't exist, and to use taxpayer money to fund it.
But there is a market, the Asian market.
What Asian market? Show us the contracts. I actually participated in the NEB hearing process, and I can tell you there that the whole economic case was predicated on $100 to $150 a barrel and no other lines to the U.S. Market. The market for Kinder Morgan's pipeline was California, but California now has Keystone XL, and it also has Line 3 going south. And the loop facility has been built in Louisiana, which will allow the new class of very large crude tankers 4 to 5 times bigger than what can go to Vancouver. The market died for Kinder Morgan here. They knew it. They protected their shareholders. Trudeau walked into a trap, and he's backed it with Canadian taxpayer money, and for that he has thrown a generation under the bus.
Very quickly, one-word answer. You mentioned the anniversary. That's with the NDP. Have they done enough to stop this pipeline?
We at the NDP, and
yes or no? I have to let you go.
The answer is yes.
All right.
And we work collectively and collaboratively on this, and we continue to do that as we move forward.
Thank you so much. Green Party leader Andrew Weaver. Colleen, back to you.
Richard, thank you so much for that. Okay, let's check in one last time with Keith Baldry and Charles Adler. Keith, let's start with you. How is the political fallout from this pipeline dispute going to affect Premier John Horgan and the NDP Green Alliance?
Well, you just heard Richard's question to Andrew Weaver there. I found it quite interesting that Weaver says yes, he thinks Horgan's done everything he could to stop this pipeline. This is the confidence and supply agreement that Mr. Weaver signed with Mr. Horgan that includes in it a reference that they agreed to immediately employ every tool available to help stop the Kinder Morgan pipeline and the increased tanker traffic. When this was signed, though, I can tell you Weaver and others thought there was a heck of a lot more tools out there in that toolbox than what we're seeing actually produced. John Horgan's opposition to this pipeline has now been condensed and has shrunk to the bare minimum, which is simply a reference case on a constitutional question in court. I think Mr. Weaver is saying yes, he thinks John Horgan's done enough now. I don't think that's what he thought the tools were going to be when he signed this agreement last year, when I think what people were talking about on the table were things like denying permits to Kinder Morgan, all but linking arms with protesters on Burnaby Mountain. That's not what's happening here, folks. John Horgan got legal advice on the first day in office that he had no legal means at his disposal to block the pipeline, and that's why you've seen this sort of semi-obscure court challenge coming from his lawyers. So Andrew Weaver can pat John Horgan on the back right now because he really doesn't have an option. He can't break with Horgan. He's cemented to the Horgan government for the full 4.5 years because he needs proportional representation, a completely different issue, and he can't have an election fought on that until 2021. So I think we're sort of stuck here.
Burnaby Mayor Derek Corrigan, a strong opponent of the project, isn't going to give up on the fight against Kinder Morgan or this new purchase. He believes opposition to the pipeline is about to get even stronger.
People are now having a confrontation, and as I've said, with Justin Trudeau narrowing his band of support, we may find that there are Conservatives joining the protests and saying, we're not here to protest the pipeline, we're here to protest them using our money. It's now his government that's advancing it. He's now the owner of the pipeline. They're the ones that are imposing this on our community. So any pretense they had to objectivity is gone.
Happening right now, Kinder Morgan opponents rallying in Vancouver, voicing their opposition to the federal government's plan to buy the Trans Mountain Pipeline project. All right, Tanya Beja joins us now with more on the reaction here in BC. Tanya, protest groups not wasting any time making their position known on this.
That's right, Sophie. There are several hundred people gathered here at Creekside Park. They are directing their anger at the Prime Minister, saying they don't want this pipeline built. Trans Mountain Pipeline may be getting a new owner, but opponents say threats to the environment haven't changed.
The risks of this pipeline and tankers project are too great to the coast, to our communities, to our climate. The opposition is still strong. There's still many legal challenges.
The city of Burnaby is leading some of those battles, challenging the consultation process, Kinder Morgan's chosen route, and obligation to comply with local bylaws. Under federal ownership, Canadian taxpayers will foot the legal bills, but that doesn't sway Mayor Derek Corrigan.
The mask has been pulled off, and we see who's behind the mask now is actually the federal government. It won't change the court proceedings as far as I'm concerned.
You could be arrested for not leaving.
He's hopeful Burnaby will no longer be on the hook for RCMP costs.
It is now all federal, and they can be responsible for looking after the policing that's required as the protests increase exponentially.
Even British Columbians who want a pipeline built say the government is going about it the wrong way.
Yesterday, we had a private company that was more than willing to foot this entire bill. Lock, stock, and barrel. They're going to pay for it, and tens of thousands of jobs were going to result because of it. Today, we're in this for more than $11 billion of taxpayers' money.
Reaction among First Nations communities is divided.
The benefits will flow to this community, and I dare say 42 other communities in Alberta and British Columbia, First Nations community, will be huge and be very meaningful to all of those communities.
The people are saying no, and the federal government is not listening. And they're still offering package deals, which are a short trade-off to what is really at stake here.
This is likely the first of many protests aimed at the federal government. The pipeline may get a new owner, but it will face the same battles. Sophie, back to you.
I'm sure. All right, Tanya Beja for us in Vancouver. Well, we have heard a lot of the stakeholders on both sides, but what about the rest of taxpayers in BC and across the border in Alberta? How are they feeling about today's news? Well, here's some of that reaction.
I think that we have to be really sensitive to those things, and I'm not sure if this isn't going to be a rush job. Do it any way you can, and then, we're going to have to deal with the fallout as a country.
I don't know how I feel about the pipeline. I mean, I can see the good in it. I can also see the environmental impact it would have on us. But I don't know how I feel about the government getting involved.
I think the government should stay out of ownership of oil field infrastructure. The industry hasn't asked the government to come in and buy anything. The industry has asked the government to do what it's supposed to do, which is enforce the rule of law of this country.
The answer is yes, we need the pipeline. But as time goes on, yes, we actually might have an oil and gas industry back.
The federal government wants to avoid becoming a pipeline owner and will partner with Kinder Morgan over the next 8 weeks to find a buyer for the pipeline. Construction costs are not included in the $4.5 billion price tag. environmental activists are questioning the decision.
It's completely outrageous that Trudeau would be using public funds to bail out a multinational corporation when we could be creating more jobs by investing in a clean energy economy instead. Kinder Morgan knows this is a risky investment. That's why they want it out. Their shareholders are laughing their way to the bank, and meanwhile, Canadian taxpayers have been saddled with a terrible investment that violates Indigenous rights, threatens our coast and our climate, and is going to cost billions more to be completed.
Burnaby South MP Kennedy Stewart, who pleaded guilty to criminal contempt after being arrested protesting Kinder Morgan, says taxpayers are getting ripped off.
They're going to have to sink hundreds of millions of dollars into the old pipeline in order to get it up to snuff, let alone the new pipeline. So this project could be $15–20 billion of taxpayers' money. It is a bad idea.